Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. May I request you to take your seat? We'd like to begin our closing plenary of the 3-day Asia-Pacific Adaptation Forum 2013. It's my great pleasure to welcome you in the closing plenary, and it was a great pleasure working with our Korean host institutes and also the co-organizers and the partners. The time flies. 3 days is basically over. It looks like we have begun this morning. We have 4 parts of this closing plenary, and we have an excellent plenary speakers who will reflect and provide their remarks. The first part of the closing plenary is to provide a summary of the 3-day forum, and the challenge has actually been taken by Dr. Louis Level and try to capture the summary of the forum. And it's my great pleasure to invite Dr. Louis Level, who is working with us since the first forum and providing the support on the technical contents and also coming up with the summary. And he is very experienced, and I'm sure that he managed to cover the key points of the 3 days, the forum. Dr. Level.
Okay, I have just a few take-home messages. These are, of course, preliminary and quite selective synthesis, some thoughts for your consideration. You might have noticed in all the sessions we've had rapporteurs collecting and documenting what's happening in all the sessions, and over the next few weeks we're going to put together a much more comprehensive synthesis, but these are some selective highlights. First of all, current adaptation strategies have their merits and limitation. I think we can see that the value of starting with existing policies and practices and learning from experience is now much more widely accepted than it was in the previous forums. For example, the knowledge of how local communities have historically adapted to flood regimes is starting to be reconsidered even when we look at contemporary landscapes. We heard yesterday in the plenary session about Korea, about how climate has already changed, and we heard some modeling work that suggested Seoul may one day have a climate more like that of Busan. In many of the sessions, people talked about downscaling climate change projections, about using better models for impact assessment. But the past, other places, and model runs are not an infallible guide to the future. Adaptation strategies need to acknowledge much more explicitly that vulnerabilities are dynamic and that multiple uncertainties remain. I think our strategies in the future have to look more carefully at building resilience, consider opportunities as well as risks, and make governance more inclusive and adaptive. These sort of features could help society better navigate unprecedented. In English, that means things that we have not yet experienced before, and uncertain climates. My second key message is that poor, vulnerable, and critical neglected groups need to be engaged more directly and meaningfully in adaptation conversations. I think in this workshop, even if you weren't in the agricultural section, many of the sessions talked about the rural poor, and it's widely acknowledged they're a very vulnerable group and in need of assistance to adapt to climate change. But do adaptation projects empower or reinforce social inequalities? We need to look more carefully at these projects. And what about the urban poor? Only a few sessions talked about them and their adaptation needs and resources of resilience. I think in the financing, we've been talking about how we can get more financing for adaptation, but there's really a limit to how much overseas development aid can be leveraged for adaptation without starting to take away from other pots. That means the assistance that is available needs to be carefully prioritized, and I think it should be prioritized to meet the needs of poor and vulnerable groups. But then the devil is, of course, in the detail. How do you really make those good quality needs assessments? How do you make sure that the funds go to the groups that need it most? And how do you design and implement projects to make sure that they actually lead to effects on the ground that really help the most vulnerable groups and don't produce further marginalization. The private sector is a critical group to successful adaptation action, but it's not here. Conversations with business will have to take place in business events and boardrooms. It's not going to happen only in the adaptation forums. Overall, we can see relationships need to be built among many diverse stakeholders, and that requires good communication skills. Different sectors and systems share many similar adaptation challenges. That's a bit of a surprise when you wander across all the sessions like I have been doing. But I have a few frank comments that some people may not like. For some systems, subsectors, and social groups, we are still figuring out exactly how climate change, or even just climate, is relevant in particular places. In these cases, I think we are still quite far from proposing and evaluating comprehensive, multi-level adaptation strategies and actions likely to be successful. Experimentation, therefore, innovation, and learning is very important, maybe even more important than small, replicated successes. Of course, if we're going to run these experiments, it's very important that they are safe to fail in vulnerable places and with vulnerable social groups. But we also heard, especially in the cities discussions, that higher level support is also crucial. National level policies should enable adaptation at the local level. International mechanisms should support national and local actions. That is not always the case. We have many examples where the level higher up is actually preventing effective adaptation action. Perhaps another surprise that I took away from this meeting is that the planning challenges in developed and developing countries share rather many features, almost as many as they share differences, including this difficulty in dealing with scale, in dealing with local government versus national agencies, and also in building legitimacy for adaptation actions in their respective constituencies. My next key message is that adaptation knowledge management that is effective increases rates of learning and builds capacity. International organizations have an important role in sharing knowledge and experiences across countries. And sure, web systems, online systems, they can help some, but not all stakeholders. And we have to realize this is only a modest part of effective knowledge management. It's not all about computers and internet. Effective knowledge systems, including scientific research programs, are needed also within countries, not only at the international level. And in these knowledge systems, I think it's clear that we can learn a lot from past projects, policies, and initiatives, even beyond the climate domain, for example, related to development or related to disaster risk management. We don't have to reinvent the wheel with all new policies. One key element of effective knowledge systems are boundary organizations. These are ones that work at the interface between science and policy, building relationships and shaping both research and policy agendas. I think those people who were here in the plenary yesterday in the afternoon listening about Korea's adaptation plans would have heard a bit about the Korean Adaptation Center for Climate Change inside the Korean Environment Institute. This has many of the characteristics of an effective boundary organization, and I think we should follow its evolution and study the lessons learned from that organization over the years, because many countries are struggling to find these effective boundary organizations, and hopefully Korea has a good example for us. My last slide is that unsustainable development is not a solution to adaptation. If we look at the recent impacts of extreme events like floods or droughts, it is clear that not only developing countries find it challenging to deal with current climate, let alone climate in 2050. Loss and damage issues are important for all countries. As we move into the future, unprecedented climates, the challenge is going to become far greater in most places, especially if development continues to put more infrastructure, livelihoods, and lives at risk, if we continue to build cities into floodplains or close to the coast. In short, development is an important source of vulnerability and risk in itself. The role of natural and managed ecosystems as sources of resilience and the interactions between climate and other socio-political and global environmental changes cannot continue to be ignored in adaptation. Business as usual development is not sustainable and is not a solution to adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Louis Leville. His from the Chiang Mai University, as I have mentioned, the summary. Thank you for providing the excellent summary. But I'd also like to inform that, as he has mentioned, there will be the details, and I'd like to thank the volunteers who are actually supporting us and providing the inputs to this summary, as well as the summary that the Louis Level has mentioned that we'll be preparing after the forums. Now, as I mentioned that we have excellent the plenary speakers, particularly who will be providing the closing remarks. And I would like to begin with inviting Dr. Yong-Oh Park, the Regional Director of the United Nations Environment Program for the Asia and the Pacific regions. Dr. Park.
Dear friends and colleagues and experts, stakeholders, thank you for being here and staying here for the last 3 days and sharing your experiences, knowledges with each other to make a better world for all of us. Although I have been with all the programs with you, I think I have heard and most importantly, listened to you. And what I have heard is, yes, encouragement and your compliment for the meetings and so on, but also the constructive remarks, comments. I think, Luis, it was a brief but very concise and straightforward summary of the meeting. I think tells what we should do and how to improve this APAN and also the forum further in the future. I think common message I heard from the last 3 days is lack of private sector participation and also the not much presentations on the government policies and strategies and plans, and also the no marketplace, meaning that the needs and the, in some sense, suppliers and demands come together and then identify the needs and the future activities. And in that sense, no place to have a dialogue and listen to each other between donors and investment communities and the needs. The reason I'm trying not to use the traditional terminology of donor and recipient is that I don't think this donor and recipient is the right terminology. And so I'm trying to use this still not appropriate, but supplier and the consumer or the needs. So I think this is the areas we have to improve for the future forum and also the APAN activities. So for this, I expect all of you already responded in the survey form, not because of the award, lucky draw, but because to make this APAN and also forum more meaningful and successful in the future. Meaning, successful meaning that because of the forum, the needs are fulfilled and achieved, and because of that, together we make this world a better place to live for all living creatures, and especially our future generations, the children's and the poor and the vulnerable people living in developing countries. So, if you haven't said enough on your survey, and survey does not have the place to make your constructive criticism, please do so as soon as you go back to your country, because yes, we need encouraging words and complimentary words, but we need more of your constructive criticism, because we are not doing this to get credit for providing this kind of platform, but to make things better for the people and for the planet. So your constructive criticism is very much needed, and we, UNEP and all other UN agencies and also other partners grow together with your criticism. So please provide your honest and straightforward comments whenever you come out with good ideas and so on, and so that we can make this APEN better and platform and the forum better together. We cannot do it alone, but if we work together, we can make a difference, because I'm a Korean. I learned it, I have seen it from my experience in the past. And so let's work together to make this place a better place for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Park, for making the additional points to the summary, but more importantly, also highlighting the need to reduce the gap between the supplier and the consumers, or where the demands are coming from.